welcome to another edition of the Deep Dive. We are really thrilled you've chosen to spend your time with us today.
Absolutely. It is great to have you here with us.
Before we even strike the match on today's topic, I want to immediately ask you, the listener, to please like and subscribe to the channel. Hitting those buttons is the absolute best way to help this deep dive grow.
Yeah, it really guarantees we can keep bringing you these incredibly thorough, cover-to-cover breakdowns of some really complex material.
So take a quick second, click like, hit subscribe, and let's just get straight to work.
It makes a massive difference. And given the density of what we are unpacking today, you are definitely going to want to be settled in.
Today we are opening up a highly provocative, deeply polarizing, and I mean incredibly layered new ebook.
Very layered.
The title is Trauma-Informed Rumination: Iatrogenic Talk, Victimology, Resentment, Jealousy, and Subverting Natural Order. And this is authored by Conrad Reicher.
And if you've been watching modern institutions, from academia to human resources, from the legal system to corporate boardrooms, if you've seen them shift their operational frameworks over the last decade and you're trying to map the historical roots of that shift, well, this book attempts to survey that entire battlefield.
Right, it's specifically tailored for men's rights activists and red-pilled men in the manosphere who are trying to understand the history of how modern institutions were allegedly captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies. This really serves as a foundational text for that audience.
Because the text covers so much ground, from evolutionary psychology to macroeconomics, we really want to instruct you, the listener, to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. That is where you can purchase the ebook for yourself.
Definitely grab a copy to follow along with our breakdown or to study it later. And you will also want to follow the author on Substack. The handle is @ConradandReicher, all one word.
Now, before we actually cross the threshold into the material itself, we do have a mandatory and very firm impartiality disclaimer to issue.
Yeah, this is crucial. We must explicitly state that the source material we are covering today contains highly politically charged content. It touches heavily on both left-wing and right-wing adjacent political theories.
Sociology, evolutionary biology, gender dynamics, it's all in there.
Right. And we are not taking any sides today. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the ideologies, or the conclusions presented by the author.
That requires emphasis. Our role today is strictly to act as your impartial guides through a very complex piece of literature.
We're here to dismantle the arguments, examine the factual content provided, and just convey the author's ideas as clearly as possible so you can analyze them for yourself.
Exactly. We're analyzing a worldview. We are not adopting it as our own.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The text opens with a very stark, almost cinematic anecdote that serves to introduce a concept the author calls the gynocentric simulation.
And what he frames as the war on reality.
Right, the war on reality. So the author describes standing in this sterile, fluorescent-lit corporate HR conference room.
A setting I think a lot of listeners are unfortunately familiar with.
Oh, for sure. So he's surrounded by mid-level managers, and they are listening to a diversity consultant. And the consultant is explicitly instructing the room that relying on objective data, logic, or linear reasoning is actually engaging in a tool of oppression.
Which is a wild statement to hear in a corporate environment.
It is. The text describes this moment not as a simple corporate annoyance, but as a ritualistic burning of the logos at the altar of feelings.
Just to ground that for the listener, when the text mentions the logos, it's invoking an ancient Greek philosophical concept.
It represents the principle of divine reason.
Divine reason and order in the universe, yeah. It is objective truth, rationality, and the spoken word that brings order out of chaos.
And the author is arguing that modern corporate and academic structures are actively demanding that you abandon the logos.
Which brings us right to the core of this war on reality. In the framework of the text, the gynocentric simulation is this societal operating system where subjective emotional states, specifically female emotional states, are elevated above physical, biological, and empirical facts.
The phrase "I feel" has been culturally engineered to completely override the phrase "it is."
The text implies that this simulation requires a massive collective suspension of disbelief.
Because if you build a societal narrative that contradicts objective reality, it's inevitably going to collide with that reality.
And to keep the simulation running, you basically have to pretend not to see the friction.
But maintaining that illusion isn't passive, right? It requires an active enforcement mechanism to police anyone who points out the contradiction.
And the text identifies this enforcement mechanism as the GSR weapon, which stands for gossip, shame, and rally.
He treats GSR almost like a piece of military hardware. How does the text actually trace the origins of this tactic?
Well, the author grounds the GSR tactic in evolutionary psychology. If we look at small ancestral human tribes, physical confrontation was highly dangerous.
Because of the risk of injury or death.
Exactly. So women, generally being physically smaller and less equipped for kinetic warfare with larger males, had to develop alternative, complex social mechanisms to police the tribe.
To ensure social cohesion and guarantee their own survival.
Right. Gossip, shaming, and rallying the collective were highly effective evolutionary tools to ostracize a physical threat without having to engage in actual physical combat.
And the text argues that this ancient biological hardware hasn't disappeared, it's just been digitized.
Precisely. Social media algorithms have basically taken a survival mechanism meant for a tribe of 50 people and turned it into a weapon of mass destruction.
The text points to cancel culture as the ultimate manifestation of GSR.
A single out-of-context statement can trigger a coordinated algorithmic campaign to unperson a dissenter. Within hours, their livelihood, reputation, and social standing are just obliterated.
It is the tribal instinct operating at fiber optic speeds, essentially demanding a sacrifice to appease the collective's emotional state.
And the author argues that the artifacts of this simulation are leading into every aspect of culture, even entertainment.
Oh yeah, there's a very aggressive critique of modern pop culture here, specifically the recent gritty reboots of Wonder Woman.
The text proposes that modern creators are essentially incapable of writing genuine female heroes.
The critique centers on the idea that instead of finding strength in unique feminine grace or traditional female virtues, modern Hollywood simply takes a man's aggressive, kinetic, violent aesthetic and shoves it into a female skin suit.
Which the text argues reveals a profound cultural insecurity. The simulation cannot define true female empowerment on its own terms, so it parasitically consumes male archetypes, hollows them out, and just wears them as a costume.
But the text moves way beyond pop culture critiques and leans heavily into empirical data to anchor this argument.
A major pillar in this first section is a paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research.
Right, authored by economists Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers. It's titled The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness.
This is a really critical piece of the puzzle for the listener to understand. The Stevenson and Wolfers study analyzed subjective well-being data from the 1970s through the mid-2000s.
And the text zeroes in on their primary finding,
which is that as women gained unprecedented legal privileges, workplace freedom, and systemic societal support over those decades, their self-reported happiness actually declined in inverse proportion to those gains.
Both absolutely, and relative to men. That is the paradox.
The text essentially asks, if you spent 40 years dismantling the patriarchy and gaining access to the corporate boardroom, why are you statistically more miserable than when you started?
The author's conclusion is that trading the private sphere of the home for the fluorescent lights of the cubicle was supposed to cure an existential void, but it only deepened it.
So if we accept the text's premise that these systemic victories are producing statistical misery, it begs a massive psychological question.
What happens to all that misplaced frustration? How does a culture process the realization that its primary liberation movement resulted in a net loss of happiness?
The text argues that this frustration mutates into what Friedrich Nietzsche called resentiment.
That word resentiment is doing a lot of heavy lifting in the second section of the book. Nietzsche used it to describe a sort of slave morality.
How does the author translate a 19th century philosophical concept into a critique of modern societal dynamics?
Well, in Nietzsche's framework, resentment isn't just everyday jealousy. It is a deeply rooted psychological pathology where a person's perceived powerlessness or incompetence ferments into a moral superiority complex.
The person who cannot achieve dominance, or who finds themselves deeply unhappy despite their freedom, fundamentally reframes their inability to find fulfillment as a moral virtue.
But it goes further than that. They begin to actively demonize strength, competence, and self-reliance in others.
Not because those traits are actually oppressive, but because the mere existence of strong, competent people serves as a painful mirror, highlighting the internal weakness of the person experiencing resentment.
So applied to the modern dynamic, the text is suggesting that the bureaucratic class looks at the stoic, self-reliant individual who endures hardship to build things, and rather than seeking to emulate that virtue, the ideology seeks to drag that individual down.
It turns personal emotional dysfunction into a form of social capital.
Yes, and the text traces the origin of this resentment to the massive historical migration of women from the private sphere into the public sphere.
The author introduces a very provocative framing here, suggesting that as women abandoned the traditional home, they effectively voted to turn the government into a bureaucratic husband.
The text describes this as wanting the historical benefits of a patriarchal structure, namely provision, safety nets, and physical protection.
But completely divorcing those benefits from any personal accountability or submissiveness to an actual individual patriarch.
So the role of the provider is outsourced entirely to the state apparatus.
And the text points out a massive, deliberate blind spot in this arrangement regarding the kinetic, unglamorous labor that makes modern civilization possible.
The author notes that for every demand for equity in a climate-controlled corporate HR department, there is a stark silence regarding the men dangling from high-voltage power lines.
Or operating deep-sea oil rigs, or breathing in silica dust in mining operations.
The infrastructure that allows the simulation to exist is entirely maintained by male physical sacrifice.
The text claims that this historical reality, that men traded their physical safety and their bodies to build and provide, is entirely ignored by modern ideology.
Worse than being ignored, it's met with resentment rather than gratitude.
Which perfectly introduces one of the most vivid psychological models in the book, the application of the Jungian terrible mother archetype to modern bureaucracy.
Just to provide some context for you listening, in classical psychology and mythology, the mother archetype is a nurturing, life-giving, protective force.
But Jungian psychology always includes a shadow side.
Right. The shadow side is the terrible mother. Instead of nurturing growth and independence, the terrible mother is an insatiable consumer.
She is the dragon in the cave. She engulfs, she smothers, and she specifically consumes the competence and autonomy of her children to keep them perpetually dependent on her.
She needs them to remain helpless so she can maintain her identity as the ultimate caregiver and authority.
The text takes this mythological concept and maps it directly onto modern administrative states and local bureaucracies.
The author gives a very grounded, everyday example to illustrate this. He describes a scenario involving a bureaucratic Karen at a local homeowners association meeting.
Picture a highly competent, self-reliant engineer who has drawn up perfect blueprints to build a sustainable, entirely legal shed on his own property.
He presents his plan, and he is stonewalled by a committee operating entirely under the terrible mother archetype.
They use the labyrinthine language of safety, community guidelines, and zoning protocols to stall and punish his competence.
The text's analysis of that interaction is that the HOA committee doesn't actually care about the structural integrity of the shed or the zoning laws.
They are projecting their own internal emotional chaos and lack of kinetic ability onto his external autonomy.
They punish him simply because his ability to build, to act independently in the physical world, deeply threatens their fragile sense of administrative control.
This psychological framing extends to the author's intense critique of the phrase, "it takes a village."
The text absolutely eviscerates this concept, viewing it not as a call for community support, but as a collectivist strategy to usurp the traditional role of the father.
According to the text, the father's archetypal role in the nuclear family is to instill stoicism, enforce boundaries, and prepare the child to face the harsh, objective realities of the world.
The village, acting as an extension of the terrible mother archetype, seeks to collectivate child rearing specifically to intercept that process.
The goal is to assimilate the child into the ideological hive, indoctrinating them into the cult of victimhood before the father can instill the virtues of independence.
A child raised by the village, the author writes, belongs to the state.
And the text goes even deeper into human biology here, leaning on evolutionary psychology, specifically citing the work of Dr. David Buss.
David Buss is a foundational figure in evolutionary psychology, particularly known for his extensive research on human mating strategies.
The text isolates his research on mate suppression and hypergamy.
For the listener, hypergamy is the well-documented cross-cultural evolutionary baseline, where women generally tend to seek and select mates who are of equal or higher socioeconomic status, competence, and physical stature than themselves.
So how does the text apply that biological baseline to modern culture?
The author uses a really striking phrase here, describing modern feminism as an OPEC cartel of the uterus.
It's a jarring metaphor. What exactly is the leap the text makes there?
It's an economic metaphor for mate suppression. The text argues that the ideological collective intentionally stigmatizes traditional femininity.
Traits like grace, submissiveness, modesty, and a desire for homemaking are aggressively labeled by the culture as internalized misogyny or oppression.
By doing this, the collective is artificially lowering the social and sexual market value of traditionally feminine women.
Why? Because it operates like a cartel fixing prices. By destroying the competition, by shaming women who actually want to be traditional wives, the cartel attempts to artificially inflate the value of disagreeable, career-focused, or difficult women.
It's a market manipulation scheme. The argument is that they are trying to corner the mating market, forcing high-status men to either accept terrible combative relationships because there is no other supply.
Or forcing those men to drop out of the mating market entirely.
Exactly. It is framed as an active, hostile suppression of male choice.
And this manipulation of social dynamics leads seamlessly into Section 3 of the text, which explores how this manufactured dysfunction is treated.
We move from the mating market into the cult of victimology and what the author terms iatrogenic talk therapy.
The text posits that victimhood is no longer a temporary state to be overcome. It has been transformed into a highly lucrative form of social capital and a viable career path.
A major part of this transformation, according to the text, is the deliberate weaponization of clinical psychiatric language.
The primary example the author dissects is the term trauma-informed.
The historical context is crucial here. Trauma-informed care originally developed as a very specific, rigorous, and necessary clinical protocol for treating individuals dealing with severe acute PTSD.
We are talking about combat soldiers who survived explosive devices or victims of horrific physical abuse.
But the text argues that over the last decade, this clinical language has been entirely hijacked by the corporate and academic simulation.
It's been diluted.
The text points out that trauma-informed has devolved into a get-out-of-jail-free card for basic emotional incontinence.
Under the current societal operating system, if a person feels unsafe simply because they encountered a differing political opinion or a minor workplace disagreement, the institution is forced to treat their emotional turbulence as an objective, physical reality.
The entire structure of reality must bend to accommodate their subjective feelings of trauma.
What's fascinating here is how the text supports this claim by citing clinical psychologist Susan Nolan-Hoeksema's landmark research on rumination.
The text uses her findings to introduce the concept of iatrogenic therapy into the cultural critique.
For the listener, iatrogenic is a medical term that means the cure is causing the disease.
It's the equivalent of a doctor prescribing a medication that actually worsens the patient's underlying illness.
So the author is suggesting that modern talk therapy models are actually making people sicker.
Yes. Nolan-Hoeksema's research demonstrated that constantly focusing on dissecting and verbalizing negative emotions, which is the definition of rumination, can actually reinforce the neural pathways associated with distress and depression.
The text argues that the modern cultural obsession with talk therapy and the hyperfixation on analyzing every perceived microaggression in daily life is strictly iatrogenic.
By obsessively talking about these perceived slights, the text claims women are actively reinforcing their own trauma loops.
They're literally marinating their brains in stress neurochemicals, creating a biological addiction to the rush of their own victimhood.
And the text argues that this addiction produces a very specific, highly destructive social archetype, the crybully.
The crybully is the perfect synthesis of resentment and weaponized victimhood.
The text defines the crybully as an activist or bureaucratic operator who utilizes incredibly aggressive, offensive tactics.
Orchestrating doxing campaigns, intimidating colleagues, contacting employers to get people fired.
But the absolute second they encounter intellectual pushback, or the moment the target stands up to them, they instantly collapse into a theatrical weeping heap.
They utilize their fragility as an impenetrable shield.
They demand the power to destroy their enemies, but claim the status of a helpless victim, so you are socially prohibited from hitting back.
The text provides a chilling anecdote of this dynamic in an academic setting.
The author recounts a specific incident at a prestigious university where a guest lecturer was presenting demographic crime statistics.
It was a purely mathematical, statistically unassailable breakdown of data.
But within minutes of the presentation starting, the front rows, predominantly populated by female sociology students, began to weep.
The text describes it not as quiet discomfort, but as loud, theatrical, wailing sobs designed explicitly to derail the lecture and hijack the acoustic space of the room.
And according to the text, the tactic was entirely successful. The empirical data was deemed violent, the lecture was shut down, the university administration issued an apology.
And objective mathematical reality was suppressed to accommodate the weaponized emotional fragility of the students.
The author takes this concept to its logical and perhaps most disturbing extreme by examining the legal ramifications of this dynamic.
The text points specifically to the deployment of the PMS defense strategy in criminal law.
The author views this as the absolute apex of societal cognitive dissonance.
We have seen legal frameworks and defense strategies argue that severe hormonal fluctuations make women biologically incapable of emotional regulation.
Rendering them too helpless to be held fully legally accountable for violent acts, including assaults.
The text points out the mind-bending contradiction here.
The simulation simultaneously legally argues that women are entirely helpless victims of their own biology when it comes to accountability for a crime, but in the exact same breath, the ideology demands that women are perfectly rational, identical to men, and stable enough to be trusted with the nuclear launch codes as President of the United States.
The author states that maintaining this level of cognitive dissonance actively shatters the logical processing of a society.
And it can only be sustained through the brute force of institutional power.
If we follow the text's logic, we have to look at the macroeconomic consequences of enforcing that dissonance.
Which transitions us into Section 4, the parasitic economy and the march to madness.
The text argues that elevating subjective feeling over objective physical reality is actively dismantling the Western engine of meritocracy.
Replacing it with a totalitarian concept called equity.
The author makes a very sharp, deliberate distinction here between equality of opportunity and equity.
Equality of opportunity is framed as the classical liberal ideal, ensuring everyone has a fair starting line and the removal of legal barriers.
Equity, however, is defined in the text as a tyrannical demand for equal outcomes, completely regardless of a person's input, biological capability, or effort.
Enforcing equal outcomes across disparate populations requires a massive, bloated bureaucratic apparatus.
Because natural hierarchies of competence will always emerge, the only way to achieve equity is to artificially suppress the highly capable while artificially propping up the incompetent.
The text looks at this through the lens of competence versus ideology, specifically within critical infrastructure.
The scenarios detailed in this section are incredibly grim.
The text outlines a situation where a systems engineer, a man with 20 years of kinetic experience keeping a regional power grid from collapsing, is passed over for a critical promotion.
The promotion is instead awarded to a social justice hire whose primary contribution to the infrastructure has been filing HR grievances about the server room temperatures being a manifestation of toxic masculinity.
It reads almost like satire, but the text scales this dynamic up to catastrophic macro disasters.
The author draws a direct, uncompromising line between corporate diversity mandates, which prioritize demographic identity metrics over rigorous technical proficiency, and massive engineering failures.
Most notably, the Boeing 737MX crashes. The text's conclusion is brutal and succinct. When feelings trump physics, planes fall from the sky.
The author also points to the bloated California high-speed rail project as a monument to this bureaucratic rot.
The text notes that billions of dollars have been incinerated on that rail project, not on laying track or pouring concrete, but on equity consultants, environmental justice assessments, and endless administrative friction.
The result is decades of delays and a total absence of kinetic results.
This ties right back to the terrible mother archetype. The text reiterates that the bureaucratic terrible mother does not build, she only consumes.
And the most glaring engine of this consumption, according to the text, is the modern academic system, which the author labels the grievance grift.
The author portrays the university system as a massive debt factory, producing what he calls a net negative degree bubble.
We see this in the text analysis of university budget allocations over the last 20 years.
Rigorous, objective disciplines that actually push civilization forward, like physics, mechanical engineering, and advanced mathematics, are facing hiring freezes and crippling budget cuts.
Simultaneously, the funding and administrative bloat within gender studies, sociology, and diversity departments is swelling exponentially.
The text argues these departments do not produce scholars, they produce professional victims who are explicitly trained to deconstruct and hate the very civilization that subsidizes their existence.
To prove how deeply this incentive structure has infected the broader economy, the text spends a significant amount of time analyzing what it calls the Patreon economy.
The author highlights a bizarre modern economic inversion on crowdfunding platforms.
The data points here are fascinating. The text analyzes creator incomes and finds that Individuals producing content entirely focused on social justice, airing grievances, and dissecting microaggressions earn significantly more money.
Often averaging over $1,200 a month from a small, hyper-dedicated base of supporters.
Conversely, highly technical creators producing complex educational content, coding tutorials, or engineering breakdowns might only pull in $300 to $500 a month with the exact same audience size.
The author uses this to prove that in current simulation, victimhood literally pays a higher dividend than productivity.
The economic incentive structure actively rewards dysfunction and complaining over building.
So the inevitable question the text must answer is, how did the West arrive here?
How does the text bridge the gap between a macroeconomic inversion and the HOA Karen we discussed earlier?
The author doesn't just blame the advent of the iPhone. He traces the historical, deliberate roots of this subversion back to Marxist ideology.
The text dedicates a massive portion of this section to the Frankfurt School and figures like Herbert Marcuse.
How does the author connect mid-20th century Marxist philosophy to modern HR diversity training?
The text outlines a historical pivot. Early 20th century Marxists operated on the theory of economic determinism.
They believe the working class would naturally and violently revolt against the capitalist owners.
But that didn't happen in the West. Capitalism was simply too efficient at raising the standard of living.
The working class didn't want a bloody revolution. They liked having refrigerators, cars, and upward mobility.
Recognizing that they had lost the economic war, the text argues that intellectuals in the Frankfurt School, like Marcuse, pivoted their strategy.
If they couldn't conquer the West economically, they would weaponize critical theory to poison the culture from within.
The author specifically points to the concept of repressive tolerance.
The idea that you tolerate all left-wing subversion while aggressively repressing any right-wing or traditional thought, framing it as necessary for liberation.
And the text also implicates the Fabian Society.
Yes, the Fabian Society was a British socialist organization that explicitly rejected violent revolution in favor of a tactic they called permeation.
Their stated goal was to slowly, invisibly inject socialist and Marxist ideals into the existing institutions of power academia, the media, and the civil service.
Using soft, gradual language until the host society was entirely transformed without ever realizing it was under attack.
This historical analysis leads to one of the most controversial claims of the text, focusing on Margaret Sanger and the early birth control movement.
The author argues that Sanger's early 20th century push to completely sever the act of sex from the biological consequence of procreation was not fundamentally about female liberation.
The text claims it was a deliberate, highly effective Marxist tactic designed to break the nuclear family.
Both Marx and Engels correctly identified the traditional nuclear family as the absolute bedrock of Western capitalism and private property.
The logic the text presents is that by severing the biological link between sex and procreation, the chain of the traditional family is shattered.
Women are extracted from the home and assimilated into the corporate workforce as taxable units of production.
With the father's role diminished or removed entirely, the state effortlessly steps in to become the ultimate provider and authority.
The text frames this entire century of social change as a long, slow, deliberate march through the institutions.
Which finally brings us to the crescendo of the book, Section 5, the Trivium counterattack and restoring natural order.
Up to this point, the text has been an incredibly dark, almost suffocating diagnosis of institutional rot.
But the author does offer a highly specific prescription. He outlines a strategy for fighting back by reclaiming the logos, utilizing the classical trivium, and reestablishing masculine sovereignty.
Just to provide the foundational definition for you, the listener, the trivium is the classical method of education that formed the basis of Western thought for centuries.
It consists of 3 parts: grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Correct. And the author maps these 3 pillars onto the current cultural war.
Grammar is the foundational knowledge of objective facts, the raw data of reality.
Logic is the rigorous, unbiased processing of those facts to remove contradictions.
Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, communicating those processed facts to sway an audience.
The text argues that the gynocentric matrix has entirely abandoned grammar and logic.
The simulation relies exclusively on rhetoric, manipulating narrative, prioritizing lived experience, and using emotional blackmail to sway the mob.
The author frames this as the ultimate battle between dialectic, which seeks cold, hard truth through data, and narrative, which relies entirely on enforcing emotional compliance.
The text provides 3 massive case studies to illustrate this collision. The first is the highly publicized firing of James Damore from Google.
The James Damore incident is presented as the perfect modern example of grammar and logic colliding with weaponized rhetoric.
For context, Damore was a software engineer who drafted an internal memo attempting to explain the gender gap in the tech industry.
He didn't use hateful rhetoric, he utilized grammar and logic.
He cited peer-reviewed evolutionary biology and psychological data regarding standard deviations in trait agreeableness and the biological reality that men, on average, are more interested in things and systems, while women are more interested in people.
But the corporate terrible mother at Google didn't care about his data.
The text emphasizes that Damore wasn't fired because his data was proven factually incorrect. He was fired because his scientific clarity made the hive feel unsafe.
He was ejected from the system because he refused to prioritize the simulation's narrative over objective dialectic. He brought math to a feelings fight and was destroyed for it.
The text contrasts that defeat with what the author considers a massive, paradigm-shifting victory for dialectic, the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard defamation trial.
The author coins the phrase the Amber Heard effect, crediting this specific cultural moment with a massive awakening for men across the culture.
The text details how, for years prior to the trial, Heard successfully utilized the ultimate GSR tactic: gossip, shaming, rallying, riding the wave of the Me Too narrative to utterly obliterate Depp's career and reputation.
She didn't need a shred of empirical proof. The media and the legal apparatus simply defaulted to the algorithm of believe all women.
But the text highlights what happened when the trial was televised, when forensic dialectic was finally applied to her narrative.
When hours of actual recorded audio, physical evidence, and grueling cross-examination were presented to the public, the illusion completely shattered.
The author points out that the trial empirically proved how the damsel in distress trope can be perfectly weaponized as camouflage for a predator.
The rhetoric collapsed the moment it was forced to withstand the weight of logic and grammar.
The author also points to the Duke lacrosse case from the mid-2000s as an earlier vital historical precedent.
In that case, a hysterical mob, heavily aided by feminist faculty members and a complicit media, completely ignored the total absence of physical evidence.
They were eager to destroy the lives of young men simply to satisfy a narrative bloodlust regarding race and class privilege.
And that leads directly into the text's scathing critique of the modern legal apparatus.
The author argues that Title IX campus tribunals and the cultural dominance of the Me Too movement essentially deleted the presumption of innocence.
The text reminds the reader that the presumption of innocence is the absolute cornerstone of English common law, dating back to Roman jurisprudence.
But the simulation replaced it with a zombie horde algorithm, where the mere existence of an accusation becomes the punishment itself, completely regardless of veracity or proof.
So, having mapped this entirely hostile terrain, what does this all mean for the listener? What is the text's ultimate conclusion? How does a man operating in this environment actually respond?
The author outlines both passive and active solutions. The primary passive solution is what he terms the Great Male Strike.
The text describes a growing phenomenon where men are quietly, but in massive demographic numbers, withdrawing their participation from a rigged social contract.
They are checking out of the corporate rat race and refusing to participate in a marriage market that legally and culturally incentivizes their exploitation.
The author asks a rhetorical question. Why would a man bleed to build a home for a society that actively despises his nature under a legal system that can strip him of his assets and his children on a whim?
But the text doesn't just advocate for walking away. It offers an active, structural solution, the formation of iron brotherhoods and the embrace of a concept called ludus.
The author calls for men to form separate, high-trust, localized networks completely independent of the corporate matrix.
He urges men to aggressively raise and educate their sons in the classical Trivium, so they are immune to emotional word games.
And the concept of ludus is particularly fascinating. It is the call to actively re-engage with the kinetic reality of physics.
The author uses the example of mixed martial arts and cage fighting to explain ludus. When two men step onto the mat or into a cage, the simulation ceases to exist.
There is no HR department to appeal to. There is no intersectional hierarchy of victimhood.
You cannot tone police a left hook or file a grievance against gravity. It is the raw, undeniable, unforgiving reality of physics.
The text argues that men must engage in these kinetic, physically demanding realities to ground their minds against the gaseous, emotional delusions that permeate the modern world.
Finally, the text calls for men to embrace the transcendentals. The author writes that men must become saints in a godless world.
This requires prioritizing the classical ideals of the good, the true, and the beautiful above all else.
It demands unapologetically embodying biological determinism, the objective reality that men and women are fundamentally biologically different in their natures and their roles.
And acting as the rational, stoic anchor that prevents civilization from drifting completely into a nihilistic sea of subjectivity.
It is a sweeping, incredibly aggressive, and highly systematic deconstruction of modern institutional power, presented from a very specific, uncompromising ideological vantage point.
It truly is a dense map of a very specific worldview. And as we bring this deep dive to a close, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to pull on your own.
It's a thread that builds on the foundation of this source material, but requires your own internal analysis.
Throughout the book, Riker heavily critiques what he calls the NPC zombie phenomenon.
The idea that individuals have lost their internal locus of control and simply become reliant on downloading the latest software update of societal outrage from their glowing screens.
But here is the challenge for you. Examine your own relationship with the digital landscape.
Even if you consider yourself highly logical, even if you identify as entirely outside the mainstream matrix, you must ask yourself a hard question.
How much of your own daily emotional state is still being subtly dictated, provoked, or managed by the very digital feeds and algorithmic outrage loops that you believe you are merely observing?
Are you truly acting as an independent, stoic thinker? Or has the algorithm simply figured out exactly which logical triggers keep you engaged and continuously feeding the machine?
That is exactly the kind of question that demands rigorous self-reflection. A massive thank you to everyone for taking this deep dive with us today.
Remember, if you want to explore the source material and judge the text for yourself, check out Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books to buy Conrad Reicher's ebook, Trauma-Informed Rumination.
And do not forget to follow @ConradAnReicher on Substack for his ongoing cultural analysis and essays.
Absolutely.
And one final enthusiastic reminder to you, the listener. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support is the engine that allows us to keep bringing you these deep, unvarnished explorations into the ideas shaping our world. Until next time.